Let's look at oogenesis. As with spermatogenesis, we can break this term down. Genesis means to produce, and O refers to the oocyte, which will develop into an ovum or egg. Oogenesis, therefore, is the production of the eggs. This begins in fetal development, which is different than what occurs in the male. During fetal developments, the stem cells called oogonia will undergo mitosis. These cells are diploid, having 46 chromosomes. There will be about 4 to 7 million oogonia that will be produced through this mitosis. After mitosis, the oogonia will be called a primary oocyte and undergo meiosis I. However, they will not complete meiosis I. At birth, the primary oocyte is still arrested in meiosis I. Those primary oocytes will still be diploid since they haven't completed meiosis I and undergone cell division. These primary oocytes will be located in structures called primordial follicles. The primordial follicles consist of simple squamous epithelial cells. I will discuss these in greater detail later. At birth, there are only 1 to 2 million primary oocytes remaining. The other oocytes have degenerated in a process called atresia. Atresia continues throughout a female's life. By puberty, due to atresia, only 250,000 to 400,000 primary oocytes located within the primordial follicles remain. These primordial follicles can be found in the cortex adjacent to the tunica albuginea. At the beginning of puberty, paracrine growth factors will stimulate the primordial cells to begin maturation. Later, the follicular cells will have receptors for FSH and will be able to respond to FSH. Approximately 24 primordial follicles will be selected. These follicles will continue their maturation and become primary follicles. The follicular cells in primary follicles will look like simple cuboidal or columnar cells. A primary follicle will mature into a secondary follicle. A secondary follicle will have a stratified layer of cells. The oocyte located within the secondary follicle is still a primary oocyte. One secondary follicle will become dominant and will continue to grow, and this follicle is called a vesicular follicle. Within the vesicular follicle, meiosis I is completed, producing a secondary oocyte that will be haploid and a polar body. We'll go over this again. The secondary oocyte begins meiosis II, but once again, meiosis II is not completed. The secondary oocyte arrested in meiosis II is released by the vesicular follicle during ovulation. If fertilization occurs, meiosis II is completed, giving rise to an ovum or egg and a second polar body. This column illustrates the maturation of the oogonium, and the right column will demonstrate the maturation of the follicle. The oogonium will undergo mitosis to produce a primary oocyte. That primary oocyte will be located within a primordial follicle. The primary oocyte begins meiosis I, and at birth it is still arrested in meiosis I. Recall that meiosis I is not completed. At birth, that primary oocyte is located still within the primordial follicle. At puberty, about 2 dozen primordial follicles with their primary oocytes will continue their maturation. The primordial follicle will develop into a primary follicle, still containing a primary oocyte. This follicle with its primary oocyte will develop into a secondary follicle. This is the follicle, and this is the oocyte within the follicle. One secondary follicle will become the dominant secondary follicle and will continue its development and become a vesicular follicle. It is within the vesicular follicle that meiosis I is completed. In females, the cell division of meiosis gives rise to two daughter cells that have unequal amounts of cytoplasm. One cell will get very little cytoplasm, and that cell will be called a polar body. The other cell with the cytoplasm will become a secondary oocyte during meiosis I. The purpose for this cell division is to go from a diploid cell to a haploid cell, halving the chromosomes. That secondary oocyte will become arrested in meiosis II. The secondary oocyte located within the vesicular follicle is released through the process of ovulation. Meiosis II is not completed unless fertilization by a sperm occurs. If that occurs, meiosis II is completed, resulting in an ovum or egg and a polar body. The polar bodies are non-viable and will degenerate. However, they are necessary to produce the haploid ovum that contains unreplicated chromosomes. The haploid ovum, when fertilized by a haploid sperm, will produce a cell that is diploid with a full complement of 46 chromosomes. That fertilized ovum will be called a zygote. Let's go back and look at this vesicular follicle. After ovulation and the release of the secondary oocyte, the vesicular follicle will become a corpus luteum. We'll study this later, but the corpus luteum will act as an endocrine structure, releasing sex hormones.